Describing everything in full English sentences or full sentences in whatever language you speak isn't always the easiest way to give the input to the large language model. Now, if you think about it in the real world, a lot of times we have our own specialized languages to describe different domains. So math may have its own specialized language, or we may have shorthand for taking notes or describing different interesting things. We may create our own little languages to be able to capture information in a more concise way than if we wrote it out in full sentences. Now, of course, the key to these languages is that the person that we're communicating with in the language knows the language too. They know the meaning of the different the statements that we're making, the different symbols or words that we're using. Now, as an example of this, we've been doing a lot of work in partnership with the city of Nashville and the emergency responders. And one of the things they do is the operators who are taking calls, and you can imagine this is a really stressful situation. They're trying to take notes down about what's going on in an emergency, and they actually have their own shorthand notation. You can imagine the stress and difficulty of receiving a call around an emergency and trying to take down information that can then be used to, take the appropriate action, send an ambulance or send a fire truck or whatever needs to be done. And so they have their own little shorthand notation. And if you go and just try to read this, you're not necessarily going to be able to read it and understand it because it's designed for people who use it day in and day out to be able to communicate with each other, but not necessarily to be as explicit and obvious as possible. So I'm going to teach you a pattern where we can basically teach a large language model a new language and then communicate with the large language model in that new language or shorthand. So this is called the meta language creation pattern. So we're going to create a language. This is going to be our meta language creation, where we're going to go and describe to the large language model what our language is, what are the meanings of different symbols or statements in that language, and then we're going to go and converse with the large language model using it. So let's look at our example here. We're going to create a trip planning application. Now, I haven't gotten into the meta language creation pattern, but I'm giving you an example that uses it. So we're going to create this trip planning application. I will describe my trip and you will list interesting things to do in the places that I will pass through. I will tell you how many days I will stay in each place and you will list possible itineraries. So far, we've just got a prompt to help us do trip planning. Now, here's where we're going to go and use the meta language creation pattern. I'm going to say to describe my trip, my route, I'm going to use a shorthand notation. So we're cueing it in that we're going to tell it about this shorthand notation. When I say, and notice this, Nashville, 3, arrow, Memphis, 2, I mean that my route will go from Nashville to Memphis and that I will stay 3 days in Nashville and 2 days in Memphis. Now, I want to kind of draw your attention to something here. Notice that I'm starting off by saying, when I say this, here's an example of my new language that I'm creating or my new shorthand that I'm creating. I mean this. And so you're taking an example and then you're showing it what you mean. So you're then saying, I mean that my route will go from Nashville to Memphis and I will stay 3 days in Nashville and 2 days in Memphis. So you're giving it basically a translation. Now, another way to think about it, this is similar to few shot examples. You're saying, here's an example of, input, here's the example of the output, or here's the example of a comment on a movie, here's an example of the sentiment analysis for that comment. You're kind of doing something similar, except what you're doing is you're saying, when I say this in my language, this is what I mean, and you're showing it the translation and the meaning behind it. The other thing to note is that my notation is much denser than the full English that I'm going to use. So it's Nashville, 3, arrow, Memphis, 2, and it's that short thing is describing this much longer basically statement that says my route will go from Nashville to Memphis and I will stay 3 days in Nashville and 2 days in Memphis. I could write all this out, but I want to have my notation. Now it goes ahead and trip plans for me on Nashville and Memphis, And I'm going to skip that, and I'm going to go down to now where I have an actual just statement. So notice we've now programmed our new language. We've done the meta language creation pattern, and now the large language model understands our language. So we say Nashville, 0, and Nashville, 0 means I'm leaving from Nashville. I'm not going to stay there. I don't want you to trip plan for me in Nashville, which is an interesting thing that has to, consider that in the logic. I'm going to Dallas, 1, and then arrow Granbury, Texas, 4. And so basically what I'm saying is my trip is going to go from Nashville. I'm not going to stay there at all. Dallas, I'm going to stay there 1 day, and then I'm going to stay in Granbury, Texas for 4 days. And it says, sure, since you mentioned that you won't be spending any time in Nashville, I'll focus on providing you interesting things to do and possible itineraries for your 1-day stay in Dallas and your 4-day stay in Granbury, Texas. So it then plans our 1-day stay in Dallas. We have a 1-day stay in Dallas. It describes what we're going to do on that day. It then describes for Granbury, Texas over here. It says 4 days, and then it describes what we're going to do in Granbury for the 4 days. Now, if I wanted to experiment with different itineraries and I wanted to really quickly have a shorthand for saying, well, what if I did this itinerary? What would I do? What if I did this one? It's a lot more condensed. Now, also, I have to admit, I'm a computer scientist and a programmer, right? So I like having things that look like condensed programming language instructions, but you can imagine a lot of people use shorthand notation abbreviations. You can use them too in the language model. You just have to explain it to it, unless it already knows it. If you're using something that's well understood, you can just say, I'm going to use this language, or I want you to interpret this in the same way that you would interpret it in a math context, and you could explain what that means. So it plans our trip. Then here's where I go and try it again. Look, I'm getting a more complex statement. I'm saying I'm going from Nashville to Fairhope, Alabama, where I'm going to stay 3 days, to Gulf Shores, Alabama, where I'm going to stay 1 day, to Montrose, Alabama, where I'm going to stay 1 day. So now I've got a much longer statement, and if I had to write that all out in words, in full sentences, it would take a lot longer to write it out in full sentences. But I've described the language, and now this kind of crazy string that I've put together, it knows to take that and use it as the input for the trip planning. So now it says Fairhope, Alabama, 3 days, and it gives me my planning for my itinerary there. So it gives me my day 1, day 2, and day 3. It then says Gulf Shores, Alabama, 1 day, and then it provides my itinerary for that 1 day in Gulf Shores, and then it understands Montrose, Alabama, and gives me my 1 day stay in Montrose and gives me examples of things to do. So you can imagine that this is a really sort of helpful capability. You may want to go and start thinking about how do I develop a shorthand notation for the tasks that I do really frequently with the large language model, and where it would save me a lot of time and effort if I could describe what I want using some shorthand, and maybe we can also describe it more precisely. Maybe there's a way to describe it more consistently. So if everybody uses the shorthand, the meaning is less ambiguous because we've already defined it in advance, and there's less variability in the explanation or in how you express it in the shorthand. So maybe you're an organization and you want everybody to express certain information the same way to make sure that the reasoning from the underlying large language model is consistent. And so now it's not always necessarily going to be consistent, but at least you would get the data, entered in a more consistent way. So you could define your own language for your organization for describing certain types of information and teach that to your people so that when they go in and they enter in that information, you're going to have a consistent sort of semantics to what that information means. Now, if everybody goes and just describes it in English using whatever phrasing, whatever level of detail, etc., that they want, you may not get the outcomes you want from your prompt. So by having your own language or shorthand, you can help constrain how you define things, how you express information to the large language model, and hopefully help it reason better.